Hello again, this is Green Dude. In the previous video, we looked at the mana cost as well as the elemental damage. Now, I didn't completely dive into damage as a whole because I don't want to overwhelm you with information, but now it's time to acknowledge something, which is that damage here also has a hit shift. And so if I go into the game, I'm not going to see 80 to 90 damage. So here's the mana cost. I'm not going to spec any points into it because there's synergies, but you can see here that the cold damage at level 1 or at level 0 is 40 to 45. And that makes sense because we have a hit shift. This is called the hit shift. And it's very similar to the mana shift. If you remember in the previous video, we also talked about how a mana shift of 8 is equal to 100%, and then 7 is equal to 50, and it keeps dividing itself into half over and over. So the mana shift allowed us to basically do decimal places for the mana cost. Well, this column here allows us to do the same with damage. So if I wanted a skill to do 0.5 damage as opposed to 1 damage, then I could set the damage to 1 and then the hit shift to 7, and then essentially it would be 0.5. Now it gets a little, it's not as simple as that because damage actually rounds up, but all we need to know right now is that there is a hit shift just like the mana shift, and it affects these columns here, which we haven't talked about yet, but we're going to do in this video, as well as of course the ones we talked about in the previous video. And so that's why here it says 80 and 90, and in the game it's 40 and 45. So for whatever reason they decided that for Frozen Orb they wanted to use a hit shift of 7. Now let's look into these columns here. So these are very similar. If you look at the top here, you can see that they're actually labeled exactly the same as these ones, but they don't have the E, and the E stands for elemental. So I explained in the previous video that for Frozen Orb, the element is cold, and then the cold damage goes here. But here we have physical damage. The game doesn't really mention the word physical, they just call it damage. But yeah, that's what I'm referring to, is the physical damage aspect of it. And as you can see just from a quick up and down scroll, not a lot of games use, not a lot of skills use the physical damage, but it is possible for a skill to add extra physical damage the same way that it adds cold damage on Frozen Orb. So if you did want Frozen Orb to do physical damage, this is where you would do it. So I would add, for example, 100, which is actually going to be 50 because I have a hit shift of 7. And then my max is over here. So I don't know, let's do 150. And so now you can see that my Frozen Orb is going to be doing, essentially half and half, right? A little bit of cold and a little bit of physical. And so if I were to cast my Frozen Orb on a monster that is freeze immune or cold immune, they would take damage from the physical portion. Okay, so these columns are for Fizz. These are all the flat values, so let me just fill them out here. So this would be meaning that our skill goes up by 1 physical damage every level and never scales up. So every single level from 1 to skill level 30, 40 will always go up by 1. And of course you can put anything you want here. And then here we have another formula. So it's exactly the same as the elemental counterpart. Here you can put in physical synergy, essentially. So if you wanted, I don't know, maybe you want Frost Nova. And then you wanted it to scale the same as Ice Bolt, then you could do that. So now Frozen Orb deals physical damage, and you can scale it with points into Frost Nova. This, of course, is you can do this however you want, and it'll work for pretty much every skill that is like a spell and that has elemental damage. You can also put in some physical damage. There are some exceptions, but we won't cover that right now. Okay, so I've explained the fizz, the cold, and the hit shift. Next is this one called CRC damage, or I believe it's supposed to be just source damage. This is also known as weapon damage because this deals your weapons damage. So you can see here, for example, Poison Dagger has a source damage of 128 and some flat poison here as well. And that is because 128 is 100% here. So we talked about how hit shift is 8 is 100%, but for SRC damage 128 is 100%. So it has a larger number so that you can get an even more precise value. Now we can look at the website for this. There it is. So again, this field controls how much weapon damage to transfer to the skill. And you can see right here, 128. So there's a lot of control. 128 is 100%. And here they've written some of the values you might find interesting. For example, if you wanted to do 3/4 damage, it would be 96 and 64. But it works essentially the same way as hit shift, except that 128 is the 100%. And so half of that is 64 for 50, and so on. Okay, so you can always come back to the website if you need it. Okay, so what does that mean for Poison Dagger? Well, that means that this skill does 128, so it deals your full attack. So when you attack a monster, you just deal your weapon's damage, not more, not less. And then additionally, you get also you poison the enemy with this poison elemental damage. So if we go back to Frozen Orb, if I actually set this to 128 here, I'll remove the flat fizz. Okay, so now before we go into the game and test this out to see if Frozen Orb can do my weapon damage, I'm just gonna come over here and remove the elemental and then save. So now if I open up my character sheet, you can see that
beware.
I am doing 1 to 5 with Frozen Orb, which makes sense because my normal attack, which is here on my left click, is also 1 to 5, and that's because my weapon is a staff that deals 1 to 5. So this should mean that every single piece of the Frozen Orb projectile will do 1 to 5, in this case physical damage. And there you go, you can see the monsters are not turning blue, they're not actually taking any cold damage or shattering from the freezing effect. Because right now I've removed all the cold damage, so I'm only doing my weapon damage. So if you wanted a spell that deals weapon damage, you can absolutely do that. So now you understand how this one works. You understand how these physical columns works as well. And the cold. There is one more aspect to damage, which is over here. Here is the elemental length column, and this is for anytime there's some kind of status effect, like an ailment. For example, if you deal cold damage, of course, there's the chilling effect. If you deal poison damage, you just have the length of the poison, things like that. So this is where it goes, because ELN means elemental length. Frozen Orb, you can see, has 200. Now, this is something else you're about to learn. It's that the game uses frames. So, let me just open this. So 200 is the number of frames. It's not seconds. The game doesn't handle seconds like that. So the game runs at 25 FPS. And so what that means is if your skill has 200 frames of slow, and then your game is running at 25 FPS, that means that it's equal to 8 seconds. There we go. So 200 is 8 seconds because 25 frames per second. And so you can see that these ones represent the growth of the time divided into 3 categories. So you remember over here we had the different levels. This is the same here. They're also separated by different levels. And if I open up my browser here, length is over here. Length per level. You can see the first one is for 2 to 8, then 9 to 16, but then the third one is 16 and above. So it has less, oops, there we go. It only has 3 tiers. And so this one is 16 plus. This one was 9 to 15. And this is 2 to 8. And this is level 1. So there you go. So at level 1, it should have essentially 8 seconds. And then it should, at level 2 to 8, it should be plus 1 second per level. And that doesn't increase right now, but you could make it increase per level. Okay, so that's it for that. On this side, you can only have, this is only physical damage. You cannot control the element like you can with the elemental. And therefore, there is no damage length columns here because physical doesn't have any kind of status element. So there's no length for this. Also, one thing that you might realize is, hey, does that mean I can't combine 2 elements? That would be true. For example, if your skill does cold, like Frozen Orb, you can make it do cold and fizz. So I can make it do fizz damage. But if I wanted to do cold and lightning, that's not possible. There's only room for 1 element here. So that is one of the limitations. And there's going to be a lot of limitations that you encounter while you follow this series. But despite these limitations, there's often creative ways to bypass those limits. Okay, so that's it for damage. Now the next thing I want to talk about is the level right here. So these 2 columns represent the required level and the max level. So you can see here that Frozen Orb is a level 30 skill, and the maximum level of hard points is 20. These are the hard points. Maybe in your mod you want to allow people to level skills higher than that. So this is where you would change it if you wanted to allow certain skills or all your skills to go up to 40 hard points or something. And this is where you would change the level rec of your skill. So I don't know what you're interested in doing in your mod, but if you want to change the location of a skill up and down, as you know, in Diablo 2, this is level 1 row, this is level 6, and so on, and then this is level 30 row. So if you wanted to move a skill downwards, one of the things you would have to do is change the level rec here. So maybe you'd want it to be a level 24 skill by lowering it. But of course, in your mod, you can do whatever you want, and you don't have to respect the Diablo 2 rule of the skills at the bottom being level 30. You can change it to whatever you want. Okay, and then here is the required skills. So you can see that Blizzard is required to get Frozen Orb, and this is how you structure your tree. So in this game, you can see, or in this character, you can see that the skills follow this arrow down to Blizzard, and then here to Blizzard, and then Blizzard to Frozen Orb. And so if you want Frozen Orb to not be clickable or accessible until you have a point in Blizzard, then that's where you handle it, right here. So that means that if I wanted to change it to not require Blizzard, but instead require Frost Nova, I would just write Frost Nova here, and now I only need a point in Frost Nova to access it. And here you can have more required skills. So sometimes you have two paths that converge onto your skill. So for example, Meteor requires both Fireball and Firewall from both sides. So you can put up to 3. Okay, and so then the last column that I want to talk about is delay. Delay is the cooldown of your skills. So Frozen Orb, everybody remembers, is about 1 second cooldown, because this is in frames. And we established earlier in the video that it's 25 frames per second, and therefore 25 is equivalent to 1 second. So this is in frames, and this column can also receive a formula. So right now it's 25 frames, but we could change it if we wanted to. For example, if I do minus, and then when I subtract, I want to make put things in the brackets, and in this case skill, open bracket, single quote, and then let's say we wanted Blizzard dot be a level, close bracket, there we go. So what this does is it says the cooldown for Frozen Orb is 25 frames minus every level of Blizzard, base level of Blizzard. So it's almost like Blizzard is a new synergy to Frozen Orb, and this synergy, what it does is it does -1 frame per Blizz hardpoint. This is effectively what it does. Now, if we do this right, then Blizzard can only go up to 20 hardpoints. So that means it should be 25 minus 20 equal 5 frame, which is 0.2 seconds. So effectively, if I put 20 points into Blizzard, I'll have a 0.2 second cooldown Frozen Orb, which will be really strong. So that motivates players to maybe spec into Blizzard even as a Frozen Orb, or you know, whatever you want to do in your mod. It's up to you. But we should go test this. So let me get a character quickly set up. And then I'm going to go test it. Now, because my Blizzard right now is only level 1, it should be essentially 1 second, just a little under 1 second. And
my magic will break the siege.
There we go. So you can see the skill is red for about 1 second. And that's working well. So the cooldown normally is still the same, and then now I'm going to put some points into Blizzard. I can only get to 10 right now, but that's fine. And then you can see the skill is off cooldown much more quickly. In fact, I can actually get 2 Frozen Orb balls out there at the same time. So before the first ball expires, I can shoot another one already. So there you go. So that's how delay works. Okay, so that about does it for this video. We've covered a lot of aspects of skills, all the most important and basic stuff for skills. And in future videos, we'll dive deeper into skill editing and making your own skill. But I think it's important to ease into it by getting the basics covered and not overwhelming you with information. So I hope this has been not too difficult to follow so far. Okay, so if you enjoy these videos, let me know and I'll keep making more. So thanks for watching.